I'm Tom Morello from AudioSlave.
I'm Serj Tankian from System of a Down.
And it is our sublime pleasure to have Professor Noam Chomsky. He is probably the most famous intellectual alive today. A recent poll of 20,000 respondents named him far and away the most influential public intellectual alive. Noam Chomsky is a professor of linguistics at MIT. His work in linguistics revolutionized the field in the 1960s. He's remained the preeminent figure in linguistics since that time. Also, since the 60s, Noam Chomsky has been one of the leading critics of U.S. foreign policy, as well as a huge inspiration to Serj and myself in our respective bands. Professor Chomsky, welcome to the Axis of Justice Radio Network.
Glad to be with you.
Thank you very much. What is your assessment of the current situation in Iraq? What do you make of the Bush administration's assessment of the situation, and what are the most effective strategies employed by activists on the issue?
Well, the first strategy that has to be employed is to look at the situation realistically. That means violating a rigid principle of doctrine. It's driven into everyone's heads that the dirty word oil had nothing to do with what's going on. We're supposed to believe that Bush and his friends would have passionately liberated Iraq. You know, if the main energy sources of the world were in Central Africa, Iraq was producing lettuce and pickles.
Mm-hmm.
Unless you believe that, you're a conspiracy theorist or some other bad thing. All right. As soon as we escape into elementary rationality, we know that the reason for the invasion of Iraq is that it has some of the largest energy resources in the world and is right in the heart of the world's major energy-producing region. And control over Iraq would increase substantially Washington's already great control over this enormous lever of world control, has been understood for forever, for 60 years at least. That's at the core of it. But that tells us something about withdrawal. It means that the U.S. cannot withdraw unless it leaves in place a subordinate client state, something like, say, El Salvador and Nicaragua after massive terror, which became client states, or for that matter, the countries occupied by Nazi Germany. In all of these cases, just like the British Empire, or French Empire, and so on, in all of these cases, there was a kind of formal independence. The countries were run by domestic security forces, the horrendous National Guards in Central America and the Caribbean for decades, for familiar to us. Domestic security forces, domestic political forces, with the mailed fist in the background, just in case it's ever needed. That's the standard imperial system. And that's what they're desperately trying to impose in Iraq. And if you listen to Bush and read the newspapers and anything, you hear that the U.S. is seeking to permit to develop a free, sovereign, independent, democratic Iraq. I mean, it takes 5 seconds to see that that can't be true. I mean, just consider what the policies would be, very likely, of an independent, sovereign, more or less democratic Iraq. Well, it's not hard to work out. Iraq has a Shiite majority in the south, where most of the oil is. If it's at all democratic, they'll be a dominant force, the dominant force. They have every reason to want to have closer relations with their big Shiite neighbor, Iran. They may not. I'd much rather have friendly than hostile relations. Furthermore, they have close links to Iran already.
Mm-hmm.
A majority of the clerics who are extremely influential come from Iran, including Ayatollah Sistani, the most revered of them. The militia, the Badr Brigade, that's pretty much running southern Iraq, was trained in Iran, has maintained linkages there. Trade and other relations are increasing. So extremely likely that they'll move in that direction. I mean, the last thing that Washington wants is trying to isolate Iran. Furthermore, there's a Shiite population right across the border in Saudi Arabia. Now, they've been brutally oppressed by the U.S.-backed fundamentalist dictatorship. But as autonomy begins to develop in Iraq, of course, it spreads. And in fact, there are already increasing demands for some kind of autonomy, or at least minimal rights. Well, that happens to be where most of Saudi Arabia's oil is. So what you can see developing on the horizon, if there is a sovereign independent Iraq, what you can see developing is a loose Shiite alliance, which will control most of the world's oil and will be independent of the United States and will include Iran. Now, Iran is already toying with turning toward the east, where there is an Asian energy security grid based primarily in China and Russia, but with India on the sideline and others coming in, working to develop their own control over energy resources independent of U.S. control. Well, if Iran moves in that direction, it becomes kind of the linchpin. If Iraq, with its vastly greater resources, moves in, it's even more so, and still more Saudi Arabia. And China knows it. Europe is easily intimidated by the United States, but China isn't. That's the reason the United States planners are so worried about China. It's not that they're a military threat or anything like that, but they just aren't intimidated. So when the U.S. Tries to block investment in Iran, the big European companies pull out, but China doesn't care. In fact, they're even making inroads into Saudi Arabia. So you can just see developing what for Washington would be the ultimate nightmare. How can they be willing to accept an independent sovereign Iraq? I mean, if these questions aren't discussed, at least, all the talk about withdrawal is, it's off on Mars somewhere. It's not even in the real world. The tactic for activists is, first of all, to get into the real world and recognize what the issues are, and then recognize that they're going to have to act in a way which may very well lead Washington to have to abandon its lever of world control through control of the world's energy supplies. Personally, I think it's a good thing, but it's a serious effort. I mean, there's a lot of comparisons these days to Vietnam. None of them make any sense. I mean, in Vietnam, we're also trapped by rigid ideology, but if you look back to the reality of Vietnam, the reason for the U.S. invasion of South Vietnam and the rest of Indochina was a concern that, and we know this from internal records, was concern that Vietnam might undergo some form of successful independent development. It'd be what the planners call a virus that might infect others, maybe as far as Indonesia, maybe even leading Japan to accommodate to an independent Asian system. Well, they weren't going to tolerate that. So they invaded Vietnam, South Vietnam first, then the rest. And the basic objective was achieved. South Vietnam was destroyed. All of Indochina was pretty much destroyed. So there won't be no danger of successful development, no virus. The U.S. could pull out after destroying the place. In fact, that was kind of recognized by planners. McGeorge Bundy, the national security advisor for Kennedy and Johnson, he said later that, reasonably, that he thought the U.S. should probably have pulled out of Vietnam in 1965. The reason was, in 1965, there was a murderous massacre and military coup in Indonesia, which killed hundreds of thousands of people, destroyed the political system, opened up the country to Western exploitation, imposed a vicious dictator who was strongly supported by the U.S. Right until the end. Paul Wolfowitz was his greatest friend, still is. So that, that ended the danger. So Vietnam was no longer a danger. The U.S. should have just pulled out. Well, as soon as you realize that, you see that there's no comparison to Iraq. Vietnam, you could destroy it and withdraw. You can't destroy Iraq, and you can't withdraw. It's just a totally different situation. I mean, we are prevented from thinking about these things because of the iron grip of ideology, which doesn't prevent us to look at things that are just right on the surface. There's nothing profound about these insights. Just think about the facts.
Obviously, the media and its presentation of the Iraq situation has a lot to do with it. How is it that most journalists, went with all of the transparent lies that the White House used to justify the Iraq War?
Well, see, I think that's the least of it. I mean, much more significant to me is what I've just been talking about. Let's say they go along with what people in power say. So if Powell says there's weapons of mass destruction, tend to believe it. Okay, that's understandable. Not wonderful, but understandable. But much more significant is the complete exclusion of the fundamental issues involved in the war in the first place, and in any talk about disentangling it. I mean, that's missing, and it's not from the media. It's also from journals of opinion. It's from most scholarship. It's kind of a North Korea style. I mean, these are crucial issues. They're evident. You don't have to search deeply for them. No complicated conspiracies. Right on the surface. And it's understood in most places. It's certainly understood in Iraq, at least judging by polls. Polls were taken in Iraq right after the president made his dramatic announcement about his messianic mission to bring democracy to Iraq, which set the tone for all discussion that follows here, approximately 100%. Now, right after that, polls were taken in Baghdad, and people were asked why they thought the United States invaded. And about 1% agreed with about 100% of Western opinion to bring democracy. 5% said to help Iraqis. Almost everybody else said what's obvious, to take control of Iraq's oil and to strengthen the U.S. position in the center of world energy production. That's elementary sanity. A 10-year-old should be able to figure that out. But here it's inexpressible. And if it's inexpressible, you can't even discuss rationally the withdrawal plans. Yeah, they'd be happy to withdraw if they could leave something in place, which is like, say, El Salvador or Poland under the Russians, Vichy France, India under the Raj. Sure, if you can have that, then they'll be happy to withdraw. And nobody wants to keep their foreign troops anywhere else.
Professor Chomsky, you've said in interviews that Americans walk up to you and ask, what can we do about all these problems facing the world? But then in other countries, people walk up to you and tell you what they're doing. Why do you think there's this big difference between activists in the United States and abroad?
Well, first of all, it's not quite abroad. The difference is between the West and the rest of the world. I hear the same questions in Germany and England and so on. It's in you don't hear them in Latin America or Africa, Turkish activists and so on. They know what they're doing. The correlations are pretty clear. We can look for an explanation. The correlation is essentially with privilege and opportunity. By and large, the people with more privilege and more opportunity feel more helpless. Why is that the case? Well, you can think of a lot of reasons, but it's pretty striking. I mean, we in the United States, but also in Europe, have, by historical standards, just incomparable privilege and opportunity. We can do almost anything we like. And we're not going to get heads blown off. We're not going to we're not going to be sent to a prison for torture. We're not going to be bombed. There are lots of opportunities, but you have to take them. And that means recognizing that it's going to be hard work. It's not a matter of going to a demonstration and nothing happened, so I quit. You have to be at it day after day. That's how popular organizations are formed. That's how you get the basis for a democratic society, which we've pretty much lost, but they have in much of the third world. Take, say, the election in Bolivia the other day. I mean, that was an election that was based, that's an extremely poor country, miserable people, a ton of oppression. But they actually had a democratic election that we can't even dream of. I mean, could we imagine electing somebody, from the ranks of the population? Not two spoiled frat boys who went to Yale to learn how to be members of the upper class. I mean, we've lost, and how are they able to do it? Well, they have mass popular organizations. An election isn't just something where you show up every 4 years and push a button. You actually plan, organize, work at the regional level, local level, cooperate, all these sorts of things that lead to a democratic society. But that takes work. And you can't do it by sporadic actions. And apparently there's something about having a lot of privilege and opportunities that makes people feel they just can't do it.
Do you feel that it's because we're more indoctrinated when we have those privileges and opportunities?
It might be. When you talk about indoctrination, we have to recognize that it has to be accepted. Indoctrination goes two ways. I mean, we know who's trying to do it, but at the other end, there are the people who are accepting it, and we don't have to accept it.
True.
I mean, it's not quantum physics. It's pretty easy to see through it. If we accept it, it's a kind of intellectual laziness. So it's the same thing, basically, comes down to the same thing as not wanting to put out the energy and effort to become really engaged in activism. And it's tempting not to. Part of what comes along with freedom and opportunity is you got a lot of ways to keep you from spending your time and energy in difficult things. And it's difficult. It's not like, say, being in Colombia or Turkey or some such place. But there are costs. One cost is just constant vilification. So you're going to be subjected to floods of slanders and lies and vilification and denunciations, at least if you're noticed. I mean, if you're not noticed, it won't happen. But as soon as you become noticed, that'll happen.
Serj and I are familiar with some of that.
Yeah, right. I mean, and that just comes with turf. And it's not very pleasant. It's a pain in the neck. The other thing is there are also there's some objective barriers, like you might be denied employment or marginalized somehow. There are a lot of unpleasantnesses that can result. But compared with what other people face in the world, and don't hesitate, I mean, we just can't even talk about these things.
You've said that industries ranging from advertising to universities are all very consciously committed to the belief that attitudes and opinions must be controlled, in part inducing a philosophy of futility. How does this philosophy of futility work, and what are some ways to combat it?
Talk about the philosophy of futility is actually quoted from the business literature from the 1920s, when the public relations industry was just exploding, and they were talking about the need to impose a philosophy of futility on people to keep them from using the opportunities that they have to participate in a democratic society. And there are all kinds of ways of doing it. We're all trained to think there's nothing we can do. Problems are all beyond us. We can't get together and do anything about them. We can't have political parties and organizations. Part of the philosophy of futility just comes from truly massive efforts to induce high-level consumerism, to make people see their only value in life as the number of commodities you can obtain, or how close can I come to looking like that model on television or something like that. I mean, we're all familiar with it. I don't have to talk about it, but business spends hundreds of billions of dollars a year on this. And yeah, you can be caught up in it. It starts from infancy. I mean, sometimes watch television with my grandchildren, and no matter how young they are, they're being inundated with it. So that's a major phenomenon. And then, there's a lot of training and indoctrination into thinking you should really only be interested in yourself. Right. Like if that disabled widow across town that doesn't have enough food to eat, it's not my problem. I didn't tell her to marry the wrong person. Why should I do anything about it? Furthermore, we have no community responsibility. So maybe individuals should contribute to Katrina, get patted on the head. But we don't even think that these ought to be government policies in a democratic society. In a democratic society, the government would be an instrument of the population, and it would carry out policies for the community. It's drilled into our heads that the government is an enemy. When you pay taxes on April 15th, you're trained to believe that that alien force is taking away your hard-earned money. You're not supposed to think, yeah, we're getting together in a democratic community and cooperating to ensure that our plans and ideas are going to be implemented. That's not what you're supposed to think on April 15th. And you can't really say it's conscious indoctrination, because it's just, but by now it's just sort of in the bones of people. They can't think in other terms.
If people are frightened that their security is threatened, they're more likely to suppress their own concerns and interests and gravitate towards strong leaders. You've said that the United States is especially susceptible to this kind of fear by comparative standards. Why do you think that is, and how is that fear engendered and manipulated?
Well, actually, it's an interesting fact. One thing I'd suggest to listeners or you is there's a great book about it by Bruce Franklin, who's a literary historian and critic. That's called War Stars, I think, in which he just traces back this enormous fear in the American population way back to colonial days. He studies it in popular literature and so on, and it's very striking. The U.S. is kind of off the spectrum in that. It's been a frightened society from the very beginning. And that kind of fear is manipulated, consciously manipulated. I mean, any administration that's kicking the population in the face, like the Reagan administration or the current Bush administration, to a greater extent than others, is going to be more likely to try to induce fear, kind of huddle under the umbrella of power. And they do it over and over. I mean, say, take the Iraq War. There was a major government media propaganda campaign, which basically took off in September 2002, to try to drive the population into hysterical fear. Saddam is going to come and get us.
Right.
It's the only country in the world. I mean, Saddam was hated everywhere, but he wasn't feared anywhere else.
Right.
I mean, even Kuwait and Iran didn't fear him. They knew he couldn't do anything. But here, people were genuinely frightened, and still are. That happens over and over. Happened all through the 80s. I mean, it's hard to imagine, but Americans were actually trembling in fear over Grenada,
Right.
The nutmeg capital of the world. The Nicaraguan army was, 2 days from Harlingen, Texas. We got to huddle in fear. I mean, looking at this from the outside, you wouldn't know whether to laugh or cry, but it happened. And the same is true domestically. I mean, fear of crime in the United States, and fear of drugs, is way out of proportion to the actual problems. You can see it by looking at comparable societies where they have the same problems, but not the fear.
Right.
This is the Axis of Justice Radio Network, and we'll be back in a minute with Professor Noam Chomsky. But right now we're going to hear a song from Evan Greer, a young singer-songwriter, part of the Riot Folk Anarchist Music Collective. You can check them out at riotfolk.org. Professor Chomsky's long been associated as a hero of the anarchist movement here in the United States, and these young singer-songwriters have a lot of the spirit of his work in their work. This is the Picket Line song by Evan Greer on the Axis of Justice
Radio Network.
That was Evan Greer with the Picket Line song, very rousing anthem. I'm Tom Morello from Audioslave.
I'm Serj from System of a Down.
And now, Professor Chomsky.
Let's talk about labor unions for a second. Most labor unions are local or national, while the corporate opponents are frequently international. Are there any promising signs of unions from different nations linking up to better fight for their rights and needs?
Well, unions are called internationals, and there's a good reason for that. Back from the earliest days of the labor movement, late 19th century, the hope was to build international organizations of working people who would cooperate because they have the same goals and aims. The labor movement and the left have always been the strongest proponents of globalization, interaction, but it's among people, not among private sectors of private power. And yeah, there are prospects of that. For example, there are now significant moves on the part of the U.S. and other labor movements to act together. Colombia is a good case in point because more union activists are killed in Colombia than probably the rest of the world put together.
Right. And
there are now initiatives from the United Steelworkers and a couple others to try to protect Colombian trade unionists. I know of personal cases, and it sometimes works. It's to the benefit, obviously, of the Colombian activists and also of the unions here. Working people here are suffering from the effort to create the lowest possible labor standards around the world. So it's to everyone's benefit, and it's just the right thing to do, benefit or not. And yeah, it's beginning to happen, can happen more. Incidentally, with regard to Iraq, it's critically important. There are democratizing elements, forces in Iraq, and the labor movement is prominent among them. But they're being crushed. There are a lot of them being assassinated. The U.S. occupation has insisted on maintaining Saddam Hussein's brutal anti-labor laws. American labor could give them a lot of support, and so could we all.
For me, there seems to be a parallel between the Saddam Hussein trials that are being held right now in Iraq and the Turkish tribunal post-World War I trials that were held to condemn the perpetrators of the Armenian genocide. If Saddam is not incriminated by a world court or the ICC, which obviously the U.S. does not recognize, it's possible that a new democratically elected government in Iraq may not recognize the decisions of the court on Saddam. What do you think about that?
Well, we're a long way from a democratically elected government in Iraq that can make its own decisions. But if that ever happens, my guess is that they would accept the conclusion. There's no doubt that he was a brutal murderer.
Right.
But here again, there's something very critical that we should think about. I mean, Saddam is now being tried for crimes that he committed in 1982, right? That's the trial that's going on now. A lot of hoopla about it. Well, 1982 is a rather significant year in U.S.-Iraq relations. 1982 is the year when the Reagan administration, which means the people pretty much in office now, in 1982, the Reagan administration removed Saddam from the list of states supporting terror so that they would be able to provide him with very substantial aid, including means to develop weapons of mass destruction, missiles, biotoxins, and so on. The fact that that's not mentioned at the time of the trials, that really takes discipline. It tells you exactly who ought to be standing alongside him in the dock. Furthermore, this aid continued, including weapons of mass destruction, right through the atrocities against the Kurds, the Halabja massacre, Anfal, all the rest of it. In fact, it continued well after the war with Iran was over. That was a pretext for it, but it continued afterwards. And it was even explained openly at the time by George Bush #1, after the war with Iran, after the atrocities. And we have to continue because we have a responsibility to American exporters, and because Saddam Hussein will contribute to stability in the region, meaning obedience. In fact, the U.S., this is from Bush #1, went back to supporting Saddam in 1991 when he was massacring Shiites. So there was a Shiite rebellion that might well have overthrown him. And Bush, who U.S. military totally controlled the region, and it was after the war, they effectively authorized Saddam to crush the rebellion. And now there's lots of lamenting and moaning about the horrible atrocities and the mass graves and so on. Yeah, the people who are lamenting knew all about them at the time and thought it was the right thing. Now, the fact that these topics are being suppressed, again, is a major tribute, not just to the media, but to the intellectual culture altogether. It's all on the surface.
And a final word, could you just briefly tell us what is it that gives you hope?
Well, what gives me hope is people like you and your listeners. And in fact, the general population of the United States. I mean, public opinion in the United States is very well studied. We know a lot about it. And it's pretty remarkable. I mean, it's almost never reported because it's just too dangerous. But there are major studies which reveal consistently that the two political parties are way to the right of the general population on just issue after issue. What's missing is that they all feel hopeless and atomized and separated, which means that in some ways this country ought to be an organizer's paradise. Okay, gives you hope.
This has been Professor Noam Chomsky on the Access of Justice Radio Network. Professor Chomsky, thank you so much for being on the show. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Huge fans. Thank you.
Bye now.